There are men in England who mistake cruelty for strength, who confuse silence for submission, who look at a woman's grace and see only weakness, right up until the moment she destroys them. The Duke of Ashford was that kind of man. On the morning of the 14th of October, in the year of our Lord 1812, he summoned his wife of 4 months to the great hall of Ashford Park, that cold, magnificent estate where even the sunlight seemed afraid to linger. And he did something that would be whispered about in London drawing-rooms for years to come. He tossed annulment papers at her feet, didn't hand them to her, didn't send them through his solicitor like a man of even modest decency. He dropped them from his fingers the way one discards a spent candle. Unnecessary. Used up. Finished. And the entire household held its breath. Lady Emmeline Ashford did not scream. She did not weep. She looked down at the papers scattered across the marble floor, then slowly, with the kind of composure that is not learned but forged, she raised her eyes to meet his. And in that moment, something in her expression made the Duke's steward, a man who had served the Ashford line for 30 years, quietly excuse himself from the room. He would later confess to the housekeeper that he could not bear to watch. No one could have known then what Emmeline was carrying. Not her shame, not his contempt. Something far more consequential. A secret she had guarded for 6 weeks with every ounce of the extraordinary self-possession that had made her, once, the most admired woman in 3 counties. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. And to understand what broke the Duke of Ashford, and make no mistake, he was broken utterly and completely before the story ends, you must first understand what he threw away. Emmeline Voss had not entered the Ashford family quietly. She arrived like something the season had not prepared for. The second daughter of a viscount of modest means but impeccable standing, she had walked into her first London ball at 17 and rearranged the air in the room simply by existing in it. Not because of her beauty alone, though that was considerable, but because of the quality of her attention, the way she listened as though every word spoken to her mattered. The Duke had noticed her then. He had simply never thought to value her. And somewhere beneath the floorboards of Ashford Park, in a locked writing desk that no one knew existed, where Emmeline kept the one document that would change everything. She had never meant to use it, until now. She picked up the papers herself. That was the detail people could never quite reconcile when they spoke of it afterward. Not a servant, not with the toe of her slipper. With her own hands, Emmeline Ashford crouched in the great hall of that cold and magnificent estate, gathered every page from the marble floor, and rose with the composure of a woman attending a garden party rather than the dissolution of her marriage. She set the papers on the hall table beside a vase of white roses she had arranged herself only that morning. Then she smoothed her skirts, lifted her chin, and looked at her husband with eyes that gave nothing away. "I will need until Thursday," she said. The Duke stared at her. "I beg your pardon." "Thursday," she repeated, as though he had simply misheard. "I require 2 days to make arrangements. I will be gone by Thursday morning, and you will have no further cause to concern yourself with my presence." He had expected tears. He had braced for pleading, for accusations, for the kind of dramatic scene that women of lesser breeding might resort to when cornered. What he had not expected was this absolute, unnerving calm. This woman who looked at him as though she were doing him a simple courtesy by staying until Thursday, as though leaving were entirely her idea. "As you wish," he said, and even as the words left him, some unnamed thing shifted in the room. Something he could not identify, and therefore dismissed. He was good at dismissing things he could not identify. His name was Edmund Carew, the 6th Duke of Ashford, and he had been built by his father the way one builds a fortress. Walls first, everything else second. He was 31 years old, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, possessed of a face that portrait painters competed to render, and a manner that made those portraits feel warmer than the man himself. He had inherited the dukedom at 19, managed it ruthlessly and brilliantly ever since, and had married Emmeline Voss in June of that year, not because he wished to, but because his solicitors had presented him with an increasingly uncomfortable truth. The Ashford line required an heir, and he was not getting younger. The marriage had been arranged with the precision of a business negotiation. Emmeline's family brought a spotless reputation and an ancient name. He brought the title and the fortune. It was, so by the standards of their world, a perfectly respectable arrangement. Love was never discussed, because love was never the point. He had made this clear to her before the ceremony. She had agreed with a steadiness that he had appreciated at the time and now found, for reasons he refused to examine, vaguely unsettling in retrospect. For 4 months, she had been his wife in every legal sense and almost no other. She had presided over his table with effortless grace. She had received his guests, managed his correspondence with the household staff, and navigated the treacherous social waters of her first season as a duchess without a single misstep. She had done everything asked of her, and nothing more. And he had watched her do it from a careful, deliberate distance, telling himself that this was exactly the arrangement he had wanted. And then his cousin Viscount Harwood had arrived for a fortnight's stay in September. Thomas Harwood was everything Edmund was not, easy with laughter, generous with attention, the kind of man who remembered your name after one meeting and made you feel, inexplicably, that he had been hoping to see you specifically. He had arrived at Ashford Park with a brace of horses and an endless supply of conversation, and within 3 days, he and Emmeline had developed the kind of effortless rapport that Edmund had spent 4 months failing to build. He told himself it meant nothing. They were simply well matched in temperament. He told himself this every evening as he watched them debate poetry at the dinner table, every afternoon as their laughter drifted in from the rose garden, and every morning as Thomas saved her the best pages of the newspaper with a smile that lasted exactly a beat too long. By the 2nd week, Edmund had stopped telling himself anything. He had simply begun to watch. What he saw disturbed him in ways he lacked the vocabulary to articulate. It was not improper. Harwood was too careful, and Emmeline too principled for anything improper, but there was between them a warmth, an ease, a quality of genuine mutual regard that made Edmund feel, for the first time in his adult life, like an outsider in his own home. The morning Harwood departed, Emmeline had stood on the front steps and wished him safe travels, with a smile that Edmund had never once seen her direct at himself. And something cold and irrational had moved through him. Not sorrow, not longing, something harder than those things, something that felt, if he was honest, very much like jealousy wearing the costume of contempt. He had told himself she was faithless. It was easier than the alternative, and he had called for his solicitor that same afternoon. What he had not told his solicitor, what he had not told anyone, what he had not fully admitted to himself until this very moment, watching Emmeline's retreating figure disappear up the grand staircase with those papers tucked under her arm, was that he had no actual evidence of impropriety. None. He had constructed an entire case for annulment from the raw materials of his own fear, dressed it in the language of incompatibility and dynastic duty, and convinced himself that it was reason rather than cowardice driving his hand. Thursday, she had said. He had until Thursday to feel nothing about this. He was already failing. The next morning brought the first crack. It came in the form of his housekeeper, Mrs. Aldridge, and a woman of 50 with silver hair, and the expression of someone who has witnessed enough human foolishness to be permanently unsurprised by it. She appeared in his study doorway at precisely 8 o'clock, which was unusual. Mrs. Aldridge delivered her household reports on Mondays. "The kitchen staff," she said without preamble, "have tendered their notice." Edmund set down his pen. "All of them. Mrs. Potts and both her girls. The kitchen boy will follow, I expect. He's devoted to Mrs. Potts." "On what grounds?" Mrs. Aldridge's expression remained entirely neutral in the way that only conceals very strong feelings. "They did not say, Your Grace." But she had paused, just a fraction too long before saying it. he noticed. He said nothing. He dismissed her with a nod and turned back to his correspondence, and then it was only when she had gone that he became aware of a sound that had been absent from the house for as long as he could remember until these past 4 months, and was now, already, conspicuously missing again. Music. Emmeline played in the mornings. He had learned this accidentally in July, passing the music room door and hearing something so unexpectedly alive emanating from within that he had actually stopped walking. She played with the kind of feeling that suggested the instrument was not a performance, but a conversation. Private, honest, unguarded in a way she rarely permitted herself to be anywhere else in his house. He had stood outside that door for 6 minutes before moving on, and he had never mentioned it to her, and he was not going to examine now why the silence from that direction felt so loud. And he went to his club in London that afternoon, which was a mistake. The whispers reached him before he had finished his first brandy. Not direct words. These were gentlemen, and direct words about a man's domestic affairs required either close friendship or significant courage, and most of the men present claimed the former and possessed none of the latter. But he felt it. The slight adjustment in posture when he entered a room. The conversations that recalibrated themselves just a moment too late. The glances that lasted precisely 1 beat past comfortable. It was Lord Pembroke who said it aloud, which surprised no one. Pembroke had always confused frankness with bad manners. "Heard something about an annulment, Ashford." He said it casually, reaching for his glass. "Nasty business. The gel done something to deserve it, or is this just your usual appetite for order?" The room went very still in the way that rooms go still when a man says the thing everyone else was thinking. "The matter is private," Edmund said. "Well, yes, they usually are, until they aren't." Pembroke shrugged. "What's she supposed to have done?" "I met Lady Ashford at the Holloways last month." "Charming creature. Can't imagine what fault you found with her." Edmund left shortly afterward. He rode back to Ashford Park in the dark, the October wind cutting at him, and he sat in his carriage with his jaw tight and his hands still and something working away at the back of his thoughts, like water finding a crack in stone. What had she done? Nothing. And that was the problem he had been refusing to look at directly. She had done nothing except exist in his house with warmth and competence and quiet dignity. And she had laughed too easily with his cousin, and he had panicked with the particular violence of a man who has kept his heart in cold storage for so long that the first suggestion of thawing feels indistinguishable from danger. He arrived home to find Ashford Park lit and busy in the way it never was at this hour, and for one irrational moment his chest lifted before he understood. She was packing. The warmth was industry. The activity was departure. Emmeline was dismantling her 4 months here with the same quiet efficiency with which she had built them, and the house was already beginning to feel the shape of her absence like a tongue finding a missing tooth. He did not speak to her that evening, nor the following morning, but on Wednesday night, the night before Thursday, something woke him at 2 o'clock, and he could not have said what it was. A sound, a silence, some animal instinct that had apparently been waiting for him to lower his guard. He rose and moved through the dark house without a candle, and found himself standing in the doorway of the conservatory. She was there. Emmeline sat on the stone bench among the potted herbs and winter roses she had cultivated from nothing, still dressed, a single lamp burning beside her. She had a piece of paper in her hands, and she was not reading it. She was simply holding it, staring at it, in the posture of someone saying goodbye to something they have already accepted they cannot keep. He could not see her face, but he could see her shoulders, and they were not composed. They were carrying something, some weight that her public self had been too proud to display. And the sight of it, this private grief he had never been meant to witness, hit him somewhere below all his careful defenses with the force of something that could not be unfelt. He stepped back before she could turn. He returned to his rooms. He did not sleep again. She was gone before sunrise. He knew because he heard the carriage. He was standing at his window when it pulled away down the long drive, and he stood there long after it had disappeared between the elms, until the dawn came up grey and indifferent over the Ashford grounds, and still he did not move. The document she had left on the hall table, beside the vase of white roses, which she had not taken, which he would find still there hours later, petals beginning to fall, was not the annulment papers. Those she had taken. No, what she left behind was a single folded note addressed to the housekeeper, containing instructions for the care of her conservatory plants in her absence. Methodical. Specific. Each plant named, its needs detailed with characteristic thoughtfulness. She had written instructions for her plants. She had written nothing for him, so he was not sure which of them that said more about. The weeks that followed moved like cold water, slow, clear, and numbing. His solicitor arrived on Friday with an expression that managed to convey profound professional discomfort without breaching the boundaries of decorum. The annulment, it transpired, was not straightforward. Lady Ashford's family solicitor, a Mr. Crane of Gray's Inn, had already filed a response that questioned, with some precision and rather more audacity than Edmund had anticipated, the legal basis of the claim. There was, Mr. Crane's letter noted with icy politeness, no grounds of incapacity, fraud, or non-consummation that the Duke was in a position to establish. And incompatibility, however sincerely felt, did not constitute grounds for ecclesiastical annulment under English law. The marriage, in short, it could not be undone easily, and the attempt to undo it was already public. Edmund stared at his solicitor for a long moment. Who retained Crane? I could not say with certainty, Your Grace. Guess. There is some suggestion that the Viscountess Harwood may have made introductions. Lady Ashford's situation came to her attention through... The solicitor paused. Through Lord Harwood. Edmund set down his pen very carefully. Thomas. Of course. Thomas, who had been writing to Emmeline, or to someone on her behalf, through his wife. Thomas, who had noticed what Edmund had been too armoured to see. Thomas, who had apparently decided that watching his cousin throw away a remarkable woman without consequence was not something he was prepared to do. Edmund had, in the space of a month, managed to turn the sympathies of his own family against him. This was almost impressive. But it was what came next that undid him entirely. He had been in London for a week, navigating the increasingly uncomfortable social implications of a very public annulment attempt against a wife who appeared to have done nothing wrong, when he received a card from Lady Hollowell. Helena Hollowell was 73, had survived 4 monarchs, 2 husbands, and more scandals than most families produced in a century, and she had the particular authority of someone who exists so far beyond the reach of other people's opinions that she no longer bothers to maintain the pretense of tact. Her note said only, "Come to tea. Thursday, 3 o'clock. There is something you need to see." He went because one did not refuse Lady Hollowell. When he arrived, to find her drawing-room occupied by the usual collection of people who orbited her, and tea was had, and small talk was endured, and he had begun to wonder if he had been summoned for no greater purpose than to be displayed as a curiosity, when Lady Hollowell pressed a gazette into his hands. Not the social gazette, the educational one, a small, serious publication distributed among those who concerned themselves with the advancement of schools for girls. "Page 6, Lady Hollowell said. He turned to page 6 and found an article, and in the article, a name. A Proposal for the Moral and Intellectual Education of Girls in the Modern Age, by E. Carew. E. Carew, Emmeline Carew, his wife. He read the article in its entirety, there in Helena Hollowell's drawing-room, and while the conversation moved around him like weather around a rock. It was extraordinary. Not merely competent or well-intentioned, but genuinely, strikingly extraordinary. A rigorous, passionate, intellectually serious argument for transforming the way England educated its daughters, grounded in philosophy and practical experience and a quality of moral conviction that made the thing live on the page. She had written it in his house. In the 4 months she had been his wife, organizing his household and attending his dinners and arranging his roses, she had also been writing this, and he had never known because he had never asked. He had never once sat with her long enough or looked at her directly enough to discover what was happening behind those composed and careful eyes. She submitted it 3 weeks ago, Lady Hollowell said, and refilling her cup with perfect serenity. Before all this unpleasantness, it has been received with considerable admiration in the right quarters. Mrs. Whitmore of the London Ladies' Education Society has already written to her. Lord Evesham, who, I need not remind you, sits on the board of the Royal Institution, has apparently called it the most compelling piece of educational writing since Wollstonecraft. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. Your wife, Ashford, is rather more than you took her for. The room was very quiet. Yes, he said. I know. He had not known, but he said it anyway, and Lady Hollowell watched him with the patience of someone who has seen exactly this expression on exactly this kind of face before, and she did not say anything further because she did not need to. The damage was already there. She had only turned the lamp up. He found out about the document on a Thursday. He had returned to Ashford Park for estate business, and in going over the household accounts that Emmeline had maintained with extraordinary precision during her tenure, he found a discrepancy. Not a large one. A small notation, a reference to a box in the writing desk in her former sitting room. He would not have looked twice, except the notation was underlined. Twice. The writing desk was locked. He had it opened. Inside, beneath a bundle of household correspondence, was a document, legal in nature, bearing the seal of a London solicitor he did not recognize. He unfolded it with hands that had forgotten how to be steady, and he read it, and he sat down in the chair beside her empty writing desk and read it again. It was a deed. Specifically, and it was the deed to a property in Derbyshire. Voss Hall, the ancestral seat of Emmeline's family, which had been, as part of the marriage settlement, transferred into his name upon their wedding. He had known this. What he had not known was what was attached to the deed. A private legal agreement dated the week before their wedding, signed by both his own solicitor and Mr. Crane of Gray's Inn, a guarantee, in his own solicitor's handwriting, on his behalf. That regardless of the outcome of the marriage, Voss Hall would revert to Emmeline's family should she leave the marriage without fault attributed to herself. His solicitor had signed this on his behalf. He had not been told. He sat with that for a long time. Then he recalled something his solicitor had said on the morning of the annulment filing, something Edmund had moved past too quickly in his impatience. Your Grace, there is a matter attached to the Voss settlement that I feel compelled to bring to your attention before we proceed. Edmund had cut him off, had told him to proceed with the filing and save the details for later. He had signed papers he hadn't fully read. He had dismissed counsel he hadn't fully heard. And he had built a case on an accusation he couldn't prove and filed it against a woman who had, it turned out, done everything correctly, including protect her family's home, in the event that he proved to be exactly the man he had, in the end, proved to be. She had known. From the week before their wedding, she had known the kind of risk she was taking, and she had taken it anyway, and she had spent 4 months trying, quietly, persistently, and with considerable grace, to make something real out of the arrangement they had both entered. And he had tossed annulment papers at her feet. He left for London the following morning. He did not find her easily. She had not gone to her family in Bath as he'd half expected, or perhaps fully hoped, because hope, he was discovering, was harder to kill than pride. She had gone somewhere no one thought to look, which was to say, somewhere she had arranged for herself long before she needed it. A small set of rooms in a quiet part of Bloomsbury, near the offices of the London Ladies' Education Society, where she had apparently been corresponding with Mrs. Whitmore for months. His cousin Thomas gave him the address. He did not look pleased about it. I'm telling you because I think you deserve one chance, Thomas said at the door of his townhouse, in a tone that suggested the one chance was more than his personal assessment recommended. Not because I think you've earned it. And Edmund, he paused. If you go to her and you say the wrong thing, I will spend the rest of my natural life ensuring that story is told at every dinner table in England. Are we understood? Yes. Good. Go. He stood outside her door for a very long time. The rain had begun while he was crossing Bloomsbury, the particular kind of October rain that London produces with personal malice, cold and horizontal and entirely without mercy. He had not brought an overcoat. He stood on the pavement outside her building in his good coat, which was now a ruined coat, with his hat in his hands because it had blown off at the corner and he had not chased it, and he was wet through to the bone, and he was trying to remember the last time he had stood somewhere uncertain of his reception. He could not remember. He had spent his entire adult life arranging circumstances so that he was never uncertain of anything. He rang the bell. The landlady answered, and looked at him with the particular wariness of a woman who has seen enough gentlemen in fine coats causing trouble for young women in modest rooms that she has stopped giving benefit of doubt. "Lady Ashford," he said, then corrected himself. "Miss Voss. I was her—" He stopped. Started again. "Please, tell her Edmund Carew is at the door. Tell her I'm not here to argue. Tell her I'm not here to—" He stopped again, looked down at his ruined coat, his hatless head, his entirely undignified presentation. "Tell her I'm in the rain," he said, "and I would like to speak with her if she is willing. And if she is not willing, I will leave and not return. That is her choice to make." The landlady regarded him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then she closed the door. He waited. The rain intensified with what felt like deliberate timing. He waited. He was beginning to understand something, standing there in the cold and the wet, something that would have been useful to him approximately 4 months and 14 days ago. That the thing he had felt watching Thomas and Emmeline laugh in the rose garden had not been contempt. It had never been contempt. It had been longing, in the disguise that longing wears when a man has spent 31 years teaching himself not to want things. Specifically, not to want warmth, not to want ease, not to want the particular feeling of being known by another person without having performed anything to deserve it. He had mistaken his own longing for a threat. He had mistaken it for evidence of her betrayal, and when in truth it had been evidence only of his own terrible hunger for something he had not allowed himself to name. He had destroyed his marriage to avoid admitting that he wanted one. The door opened. She was not what he expected. He had been expecting the composed woman of the great hall, the one who picked up papers from marble floors with steady hands. Instead, the woman in the doorway was tired. Not diminished, but honestly, visibly tired, in the way that people look when they have stopped performing for an audience. She wore a plain dark dress, and her hair was simply arranged, and there was a smudge of ink on her left hand, and she looked at him with an expression he could not read, and had apparently not yet decided upon. "Your Grace," she said. "Don't," he said, before he could stop himself. She waited. "Don't call me that, please." He exhaled. "I have been rehearsing what to say to you for the better part of an hour, and I've discarded every version because every version sounds like a man who believes he can arrange an apology the way he arranges an estate, efficiently, with the optimal outcome in mind. And I don't want to do that." He looked at her directly, perhaps for the first time. "I was wrong. Not in a small or complicated way. In the plainest, most fundamental way. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about myself. And I was wrong about what I threw away, which I only fully understood when I read your article in Lady Hollowell's drawing room and realized I was reading the work of a woman I had shared a house with for 4 months and never actually seen." Something moved through her expression. Not softness, not yet. Something more complicated than that. "You read it," she said quietly. "3 times. I've ordered the rest of the Gazette." He paused. Lord Eversham was right. It is remarkable. She looked down at the ink on her hand, and her throat moved. "What do you want, Edmund?" His name in her mouth, the first time she had ever said it. "I don't know how to ask for what I want," he said, I'm aware that is precisely the problem, and also that it is not your problem to solve. But I'm asking, not for reconciliation. Not yet. I'm not arrogant enough to ask for that. I'm asking only for the opportunity to know you, the way I should have tried to know you from the beginning. Properly. Without agenda. He paused. I'm aware I'm making this request in the rain, without a hat, still looking like a man who has recently made a series of catastrophic decisions. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Come inside, she said after a moment. Before you catch your death, I will make you tea and you will sit across the room from me and not assume anything, and we will talk. That is all I'm offering. That, he said, is more than I deserve. Considerably more, she agreed, and stepped back from the door. He crossed the threshold. What followed was not a reconciliation, not that evening, not that month. It was slower and stranger and more difficult than that, because Emmeline Carew was not a woman who had forgotten anything, and Edmund was not a man who changed overnight, and the distance between who they had been to each other and who they were capable of being was not crossed in a single conversation over tea in a Bloomsbury sitting room. But it was crossed, slowly, by degrees, in the way that things which have been genuinely damaged are sometimes, against all reasonable expectation, repaired, not restored to what they were, but rebuilt into something that knows its own history, that bears its scars without shame, that is stronger in the broken places, precisely because the breaking was survived. He withdrew the annulment papers in November, quietly, through his solicitor, with a note to Mr. Crane that expressed, in formal language, the Duke's acknowledgement that he had proceeded on inadequate grounds and wished the matter resolved without further proceedings against either party. Mr. Crane sent a reply consisting of a single sentence. My client has received your correspondence and offers no objection to the withdrawal. He took that as encouragement. The article brought Emmeline to prominence in the circles that mattered to her. By December, she was meeting regularly with Mrs. Whitmore and the Ladies' Education Society, and by January, she had been invited to speak at a private assembly of reformers that included, among others, Lord Eversham and 3 members of Parliament. She had, entirely through the work she had done in the margins of his house, established herself as a voice worth hearing. He attended that assembly. He sat in the back. He did not tell her he was coming. And when she rose to speak, when he watched her address a room of powerful men with the same composure and the same steel he had once watched pick papers from a marble floor, he understood with finality that he had not merely misjudged his wife. He had been given a gift he was not yet worthy of, and he had known it, and he had done the only thing a man does when he is terrified of receiving something he believes he doesn't deserve. He had destroyed it first, to take away the possibility of its being taken from him. He found her afterward in the corridor, and he told her he had been there, and he watched her face go through several things very quickly before it settled. Why? She said. Because I wanted to see you, he said. Because I have wanted to see you every day for the last 3 months, and I did not feel I had the right to say so. He paused. Have I earned the right yet? She was quiet for a long time. Not entirely, she said, but you are getting closer. He took her to dinner. That was in January. In February, they walked in Green Park on a Sunday afternoon, and she told him about her childhood at Voss Hall, the library her mother had built, the lessons her father had refused to limit by gender, the book on education that had been forming in her mind since she was 15 years old and had not yet found its final shape. He listened without interruption, which he suspected was not his natural condition, but was becoming, through practice, somewhat easier. She asked him, before they parted, what he had been afraid of. Not as an accusation, as a genuine question. He told her. He had not told anyone before. March came. She returned to Ashford Park. Not as his wife, not formally, not yet, but as a guest at his invitation, because the conservatory she had planted was in full bloom, and he had written to her with something close to sheepishness to say that he thought she might like to see it. She did. She walked among the herbs and roses for a very long time while he stood at the door of the conservatory and watched her and said nothing. And eventually she turned and looked at him with an expression that was not composed or careful, but simply, unguardedly, her. "It's still alive," she said. "I had Mrs. Aldridge following your instructions to the letter," he said. "She was very exacting about it." "She always was." A pause. "Edmund." "Yes. I'm not the same woman you married." "I know. And you are not the same man who drove her away." "I am trying not to be." She looked at him for a long time among the roses and the rosemary. "Then perhaps," she said, we should try again, as different people, who know rather more about themselves than they did in June." He crossed the conservatory in 4 steps. He did not touch her. He had learned to ask before he assumed this too a practice he was acquiring by degrees. But he stood close enough that she could see his face clearly, everything in it that he had spent a lifetime learning to hide and was now, painstakingly, learning to show. "I would like nothing more," he said. She reached up and took his hand. Just that, his hand in both of hers, the way one holds something fragile and valuable that has been retrieved from a considerable height. "Don't waste it this time," she said. "I won't," he said. "I promise you I won't." They were remarried, in the eyes of the law and their own, in a small ceremony in April, attended by Thomas and his wife, and Mrs. Aldridge, who wept with unsentimental efficiency into her handkerchief, and Lady Hollowell, who pronounced the entire affair satisfactory and helped herself to a second piece of wedding cake. The book Emmeline published the following year, the one she had been forming since she was 15, was dedicated simply to those who were underestimated, and to the one who finally learned better. Edmund read the dedication 3 times. Then he set the book on his desk, where it remained for the rest of his life, the spine facing outward so that it was the first thing he saw each morning when he sat down to his correspondence. Some men learn slowly, some learn too late. Edmund Carew, 6th Duke of Ashford, learned in the rain outside a Bloomsbury lodging house, hatless and humbled, with the cold working through his good ruined coat, and the door not yet open, and the outcome entirely out of his hands. And if that is not the most valuable lesson a proud man can receive, I don't know what is. If this story moved you, if you found yourself rooting for Emmeline, or perhaps recognizing something of the Duke in a corner of yourself you rarely examine, then you are in the right place. Subscribe to the channel and stay close, because there are more stories here of pride and consequence, of love arrived at too late and sometimes just barely in time. Share this one with someone who needs to hear it today. And remember, the bravest thing a person can do is cross the threshold after they have knocked and wait in the rain and leave the outcome to someone they have not yet deserved.